taken as meaning that they're perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later and explain what it means, why this is important, and what it means for us and our work. Okay, and they cover specifically our public-facing websites, intranets and extranets, and mobile apps, including all the content on those, such as PDFs. Hey there. So just kicked off. And so why? What's the aim of these? They have been introduced to make sure that our web services, or public sector web services and content, is accessible to everyone, including those with disabilities. It's really easy to accidentally introduce barriers, which makes it impossible for some users to access those services. So it's really making sure they have equal access. It's all about inclusivity. And it means that digital products need to work for people who have, for example, limited vision or no vision, no perception of colour, with hearing issues, the whole range from, limited to deaf, limited dexterity or cognition issues, and without speech. So it covers a really broad range of abilities. That says the same thing. So a really important point is that what's necessary for some is good for everyone. So accessibility best practice improves usability for all. So this slide gives you an example of someone who is deaf, someone who is temporarily got hearing issues due to an ear infection, and someone who's working in a really noisy environment. All of these, for different reasons, would struggle with some sort of content, for example, audio, and would need an alternative. So, for example, video captions. And this can be also applied to all of the different types of impairments, visual impairments. Good colour contrast also helps everyone avoid eye strain. Someone who's colourblind would benefit from us not using colour to convey important information. In fact, you can't do that. You can't use just colour. You have to also use another means to convey that information, because otherwise they'll miss it. So if you do a green and a red, and that exact case came up recently on our vehicle checker to convey important information, they will miss it. They won't actually be able to get that. Okay, so that's really important to understand, really, that good accessibility practice means more people can use our digital products. It just improves the quality for everyone. Okay, so what do we need to do? How do we implement this? Public sector bodies will need to do these summarised things: evaluate the accessibility of all their existing websites and mobile apps, fix the issues. There is a slight get-out clause in that if something is considered, making it compliant would be a disproportionate burden, then you can make a case for that. And also certain types of content are exempt. This is really intended for smaller organisations to take account of their size and their resources and also the function. So you can weigh these up, the estimated costs of making it accessible, for example, and the benefits against who your audience is, how often it will be used, and its lifespan. If it's only going to be live for a month, then you've got a case. But for us, generally, that's not going to be an option, I would say. But it is there. It's very kind of pragmatic law. In terms of examples of content exemptions, this would be PDFs which were published before September 2018, pre-recorded live video before September 2020, live video, for example, live press conference, because that's so difficult to make accessible, online maps and mapping services. That's provided there is an accessible version which provides the same information. So, third-party content which we have no control over. That's okay. And extranets and intranets which were published again for September 2019. Unless we redevelop them, in which case we are required to make them accessible. So there's specific exemptions, but what we have to do is be really clear about. We also have to publish an accessibility statement. And that's another key part of the legislation. So we have to explain what we've done to make it accessible and which parts are not accessible. And this needs to include links to any alternatives, a feedback mechanism, and a link to the defined enforcement procedure, so people can raise formal complaints if they want. So yeah, that's interesting. There's no real way out of that, but there's more to come on that. And even if something is a disproportionate burden, we still need to make adjustments for people with disabilities, for example, by providing the information in a different format. So when do we need to do this by? So there's different stages. For new websites, the deadline is imminent, so it's September, this September. So everything that we're building now needs to be built to be accessible, all new content and functionality. Existing websites, we have longer, because obviously that's quite complex to go back and audit. So we have an extra year, September 2020. And mobile apps, again, we have another year. So it's really actually designed that we can achieve it, but we do have to move because it's going to be quite involved. Okay, so GDS has advised that we can meet this, meeting the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines to level 2.1 AA will mean that we're compliant. So I'm going to explain a little bit about what those are, but essentially they're a shared set of guidelines or international standards for web content accessibility. And why not AAA? Because there's 3 levels. So it's because AAA is very difficult to achieve. So it's considered that AA is the minimum level that we need to achieve. In some cases, depending on your audience, you might want to go for AAA or include that in your brief. For example, for accessible housing search, which we developed at the end of last year, that was our target, AAA, but our minimum requirement was AA. And these guidelines are organised under the 4 principles I mentioned earlier: perceivable, operable, understandable and robust. So a bit more on those. What does that mean? Perceivable means that your content has to be available to at least one of the senses. So if somebody can't see it, they can still hear it, or vice versa. So if you have visual impairment, you can adjust the size and contrast. It's good enough that you can see it. And if you're blind, your screen reader will work with the content, so it can read it out to you effectively. And if you're deaf, there's a text representation, so you can still get the content. So that's the first one. It just can't be invisible to all of their senses. And this is, I'm going to skip over, but that's examples of how this principle translates into the guidelines. So yeah, again, that's the colour issue. You have to be able to still understand it if you can't distinguish colours. And you can't use visual characteristics to communicate, or not only visual characteristics to communicate information. For example, icons. If you're using icons to convey key information, you need to also explain it in text or by another means to ensure that people can understand it. Okay, so it's not enough for the user just to be able to perceive something, they also need to be able to understand it. And this is really about using clear and simple language that's easy to understand. So people have a range of processing and cognitive abilities which could affect this. For example, someone with dyslexia might struggle with really long, dense paragraphs of text. So we need to be really conscious of this when we're creating content and designing services. Autistic people is another example. They often have heightened sensory awareness. So they can find busy pages really overwhelming, and they tend to need consistency. So making sure that the way our interfaces work are consistent and predictable, in fact, helps people understand the content. So for using a standard, recognised element like a hamburger menu for something that's unexpected really confuses people. Even, that's general usability, good practice anyway, but for people with those disabilities, it makes it impossible for them to understand. Okay, and as I mentioned, for most this simply means avoiding jargon, acronyms, complex sentences, and people with learning and cognitive disabilities really depend on that. But it also makes it easier and more usable for everyone, including people, for example, who are less fluent in the language, where English is their second language, have low literacy, or are just really not familiar with a complex topic. So this is, it makes it easier for everyone to understand and skim.
Is there like a sort of reading age that you should be aiming for?
I think the reading age is about sort of 10 to 12 is the recommended one, so it's quite low. If they can understand it easily, that's really your general target. But I don't think that's in the accessibility requirement, but that's general, good practice recommendation. The next one is operable. So as well as perceiving it, understanding it, they need to be able to work it. And an example of this is not everyone uses a mouse to interact with digital content. Some people have motor impairments, which means they can only use the keyboard, or, for example, speech recognition software. So our services need to work with whatever input device people are using, so they can do what they want. They can visit the page they want to, they can interact with forms, and they can click on buttons and use the navigation. And do that keyboard only, for example. So that's really key. So here as well, you've got our page titles descriptive of their purpose. So the reason for this is, again, it helps the average user, but users who are blind typically use a screen reader feature to get a list of currently open windows by title. So if you have really long titles or inappropriate ones or missing titles, then they simply can't understand it. So this is, again, an important one. Or if users can't determine the purpose of the link, blind users, again, often access lists of links without the context around them, so it makes it doubly difficult. So these are just further examples. And finally, the service needs to be robust. That means it's built in such a way that it works with the technologies that people are using. So some of the ones I've already mentioned, screen readers or voice recognition software, or voice browsers, screen magnifiers, they need to work with all of that. And this really is a technical one. So that's not so much about content, but it's ensuring that it's marked up in the HTML correctly. And all of these 4 key elements need to be there, or the user won't be able to do what they need to do. So again, this is a few more examples for content editors, using plain language, breaking up content, writing descriptive links. It's not rocket science, but all of this makes a real difference. And designers and developers, it's making content legible with good colour contrast, designing interfaces that are simple, providing large hit areas for buttons, error messages. Again, these are just a few examples, but this is the type of thing that the legislation really is requiring us to do. Another important consideration is that you need to identify where solutions exclude people. And maps are a really good example. So not everyone can use an interactive map. If you can't see the map, you can't use it. If you can't drag the map, and if you don't understand how it works, there are groups of people that this would be impossible for. So it is an exclusion, but what do you do with that content then? We've got a lot of maps across our sites, and it's really engaging content too for many users. So what you do in this case is you provide an alternative. So here you can see on accessible housing again, we've given immediately, before you even hit search, the user has the option to go to list only. So they can skip over the map that is not going to help them and see the content they need in a different way and still access it. So these are the type of things you need to consider in designing a service. So what happens if we don't do it? So this is still being defined exactly, but we do know that there's going to be some automatic auditing of sites. And obviously, the more high profile you are, the more likely that is to happen. And public bodies may, as a result of that, be issued with a determination of non-compliance, which will give you time to act on it. And if you don't act on it, you can go back and ask for a review and say, yes, there's a reason for this, and have a justification. But if it's still upheld and you're just not complying, then the Minister for Cabinet Office can publish the name of the GLA in a list of non-compliant organisations along with the details. So really this is reputational damage is really the stick in this one. But non-compliance also potentially can result in claims for discrimination, because non-compliance with this will be treated as a failure to make reasonable adjustment as per the Equalities Act and the DDA in 1995. So this, individuals have the right to complain to the enforcement body, and where we fail to comply with a request, for example, to provide information in an accessible format. Okay, and who will enforce it? No announcement's been made, but I have heard that it's going to be the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And they're still working on the legal details with GDS, so we should hear about that soon. So, yeah, and the key things are non-compliance could result in discrimination claims and reputation damage, but also the GLA really, we did some research across the organisation, and what came back as really strongly from everyone we spoke to, I think there were about 15 interviews across different teams, was that everyone felt that the GLA should be setting an example on this, and it was really about inclusion, and we should be leading as the public, in our position. So, in summary, the importance of accessibility for our users, it means our content and services are accessible to all. Accessibility best practice leads to a better user experience for everyone, improves the quality of all our products. It gives us an opportunity to lead by example and ensure we embody best practice on inclusion. It also means we avoid reputational risk and potential discrimination claims. So the next steps for us is that we're already building accessibility into products currently being built, for example, Team London. We've got accessibility testing throughout the process. And also we're building compliance with the WCAG 2.1 AA in all our new contracts and requests for proposals. So what we do need to do is find a way to make sure that also happens on smaller projects where the contracts are not going by, the briefs are not always going by TG or digital. We just need to make sure that it's across the organisation and it's really well understood. For existing sites, we've gone through a process now of identifying all of our sites and categorise them according to the association with the Mayor, for example, whether we use the Mayor of London's brand, whether it's supported by the Mayor of London, whether it's an independent site that we fund it, because we need to decide what we do in all of those specific cases. And we've got lists of all the different content types, because you can imagine it's really, really onerous to try and check every page across a site over 1,000 pages. So what you can do is really focus on your key user journeys, the most important user journeys, and audit those first, and make sure that those are accessible. And also all of your content types. So if you might have lots of different content, but they all use the same content type, you should capture most of the accessibility issues, as long as the content editors and designers are doing their work well. So, yeah, we need to audit all our existing sites and web apps by September 2020 and fix them. So that's the point. Then, in addition to that, what we're looking at doing is we want to make accessibility part of our process. So it's something that degrades over time. So we have to find a way of ensuring that we build it into our processes, that people are upskilled, that we upskill teams now, and we find a way of passing on and sharing that knowledge over time. So that is another key focus. We want to make sure that we can maintain this. In some cases, it may also be a case of taking legal advice on any grey areas. So that's the process that we're working through at the moment. And we've got a brief out with several different agencies in terms of proposals for auditing London.gov in particular. So, almost at the end, if you need to talk to someone within the GLA, for content, best to go straight to the digital team to talk to content designers. For design issues, creative team will be able to answer most of your questions. And if there's anything that falls outside that, or general questions, digital project questions, then you can come to me, because at the moment I'm working on the accessibility strategy for this, basically. And finally, in case you want to find out more, there's loads of resources, particularly on GDS providing a lot of information. And if you're a product owner, you're creating a service, this first one's really useful. It covers testing, different types of testing, expert reviews, user research that you might want to consider. The legislation doesn't prescribe what we need to do exactly in terms of that, except meeting the WCAG guidelines, but you may want to do more. You may want to kind of go beyond that, especially depending on your audience. If you think that, yeah, I'd definitely recommend considering all of these because that would be best practice. It's just you're going to have to find that balance for different products and different functionality. For teams that want specific information, and this is also a useful link, it's an American site, but it gives accessibility guides aimed at certain roles. So you've got one for content, one for designers, one for product people, one for user experience. So that's really quite useful. It's based on WC 2.0, but don't let that put you off because really that only changed very recently, the end of last year really, they updated the guidelines, and mainly the new stuff is around mobile. So these will still be applicable. And there's general accessibility reading list as well on GDS, which gives really useful starting points if you want to just generally find out more. That's a really good place. So I'll send around these links afterwards as well. So that is it. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I do. So you said you've identified, well, you've looked at all the sites owned by GLA and Volunteer for Listing, I guess, things to be done. Do you have a timetable where you're going to go to teams and tell them, well, maybe do a bit of presentation and what they need to change?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Because otherwise, I guess everybody would come to you at the same time, and maybe hopefully.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we're still working at the moment. What the stage we're at is we've done sort of interviews throughout the GLA, as I mentioned, and that was really useful to understand where we are. And it came back with, you know, I think people had a lot of assumptions about accessibility and who was handling it, and everyone thought someone else was dealing with it. So creative, you know, might think digital are dealing with it, digital might think the agency are dealing with it, the agency might think someone else, the testers are checking it. So we found out that we really need to embed that in our processes, and we really need to make sure that we are communicating a lot more strongly. So yes, that's going to be part of the strategy, the communication plan. It's not there yet in terms of deadlines, but that should be very soon. And we've asked agencies for their recommendations as well on approach, so we're going to look at that, and once we've got that information then we'll be getting in touch again.
Is there coordination across the GLA group with any of this, like style, you know?
Yeah.
So that we're consistent with how we're, you know, presenting our information.
Yes. Again, we don't know at this point, so we've got that as part of our internal order. We've identified all of the sites that are part of the GLA group and who to contact. So we're going to kind of then, we haven't decided exactly yet what we're going to do, but we're definitely going to share what we're doing with them and recommend at the very minimum the approach.
So with the website, you upgraded it a couple of years ago?
Yeah, a few years ago.
Yeah. How robust is it against this? Because it feels like, you know, I don't want you guys to be starting from scratch with where you've got to with the website.
Yeah, I don't think we're starting from scratch. It was built to the accessibility standards of that time. They've obviously changed a little bit, but also it does happen. I think that was the traditional way of dealing with accessibility. Have an audit, leave it for 5 years, and it degrades over time, because it degrades, and if you don't kind of create your content in the right way, if you create new features which aren't built to be accessible, over time that does happen. So you always need a process. We're always going to need some sort of auditing process. But really, the more we increase our knowledge, the less we'll have to do that. If we're always testing as we build new features, and the knowledge increases with all the testing team and with content editors across the organisation, then that's going to be, that gap is going to be less and less. So it's never going to be, perfect. But I think probably the gap has widened to the point where, again, from the interviews that we had across the organisation, the people that knew more about it were more worried, had less confidence that it was accessible, because I think you're aware of how that happens.
I've noticed recently on the BBC website, their videos now have the subtitles. Before, you know, sitting in the office, you think, can't be sat there, but now that comes up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that was them getting ready. But what about our committee meetings? I'm listening to oversight at the moment. How are you going to deal with, subtitling that?
Yeah.
That's
Again, there's some exemptions. So if it's a live kind of video, then
But
that's
I'm-
exempt. But
oversight was Monday, so I'm looking at Monday's oversight committee. So
yeah,
yeah.
then we're going to have to look at captioning or how we handle that. Yeah.
That's
So it
good.
is that the implications are potentially quite big. So at the moment, it's about identifying and understanding what we need to do and where we can justify not doing it. So an important part of this legislation is the accessibility statements, which are a requirement, and they're going to be creating a template any time now. They said early 2019, which we can use, but that's about explaining what we're doing and where we're not doing it yet. So we do have that option, but it's just like we can't be not doing anything. We can't be not recognising it,
No.
and it would be that wouldn't be what we want to do anyway. So yeah, it's going to be a case of how we can build it in over time and how we can phase that and make sure we're doing the maximum that we reasonably can.
Yeah.
Well, it might be a case of we again providing it in an alternative format.
So transcription.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be compliant.
Okay.
So we've just got to find an achievable way of doing that that's appropriate for the content.
Because it's very expensive.
Yeah.
I know this from getting the London Plan translated into different languages. We did
Yeah.
Braille at one point, and that was hellishly expensive.
But if you, on that, again, there are tools that kind of blind people would use. So as long as you're building your site and your content in the right way, you can avoid that as much as possible. But yeah, that's plan B. And I think the main thing you have to do is, if someone asks for it as well, that you have to kind of act on that.
Oh,
And that will be happening. I think will be held to account by our users.
okay. Thank you. That was very useful.
Are there any specific guidelines for social media or email?
Social media email, that's not covered by this specific legislation,
Right.
but again, it would be good practice
Yeah.
to look at that. So I definitely, I can get back to you and I couldn't say off the top of my head, but I think it's not covered within this because some of it's out of your control. Third-party tools to some extent and user-generated content, we can't. But it's content that we are producing as much as possible we should be, and what you're linking to should be.
So what we started doing in the digital content team is to write the alt text as image description, so whenever it's an image or a graphic.
Yeah.
But that's, I reckon that's just one thing.
One aspect, yeah.
And there might be other things that we're not
Yeah.
conscious of that would make it more accessible. If you had any social media or email guidelines,
Yeah.
that would be good.
What I can do is check and send you any kind of information that I find on that. But yeah, it's definitely not, it's not part of this. But yes, you're right. Images, alt text is just good practice, and it will make it easier for you.
I think for emails that there's a thing about making content XML available XML only. So you can have text only. So you can have two versions.
Two versions.
I think there are some regulations about that in WCAG,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure.
Yeah. No, you're
Probably
probably
have seen that
right.
somewhere.
Yeah. I'm sure you're right.
Yeah. I think we're doing that anyway.
Yeah.
We do.
There's
I'll
probably
double
stuff
check.
there's probably, to be honest, that's probably something that's not specifically within this legislation, but is within WCAG and
Yeah,
should
yeah.
be doing. So yeah.
We've got, maps and graphs, because loads of our documents had that through it. So will there be some standardised text, just to get everyone, again, using the same type of descriptors?
Yeah.
Just a consistency in these. So, so we're all using the same wording, essentially.
Yeah, I think once we've kind of set out a few examples, then we can share that. Then
Yeah.
that's probably the easiest thing, and say that's our kind of ideal, and this is what the minimum is. But it is going to be quite a big process to work through all the different types of content. So
Because all the teams use their own type of language, essentially.
yeah,
It's worth also, we do have editorial guidelines.
We do, but once you get people getting down and one officer goes and someone else comes in, there is, we're all
yeah,
not always using the same terminology.
Yeah.
You know, just describing the GLAD group as the GLAD family, their themes, functionality. You know, we use lots of different terms meaning the same thing, so it's going to make your life interesting for a bit.
Yeah, but I think that there's some things which are kind of pure content, I'd say, so we probably need to kind of split them into streams and have content as one focus, and then that knowledge can be passed on via the content editor training as well. So yeah,
It's just consistency.
but it's a really
terrible at that.
Yeah.
Really. Because all teams like to do it their way. Their style.
Yeah.
No, I've read through the content guidelines and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But thank you.
Thanks very much.